Welcome to Payday, a podcast focused on the modern employee pay experience. We'll be talking global payroll, payments, on-demand pay, and all the employee experiences in between. I'm your host, David Barak. On this episode, I'm joined by Dimitri Papageorgiou and Linda Obertin. They're two industry experts that are examining new technologies and their impact on payroll, payments, and HR. So I sat down with both of them to talk about blockchain, smart contracts, data custodianship, and so much more.
The smart contract in the context of payroll can actually be used to take the employment contract that one has and convert it into a predictable, repeatable transaction. In essence, instead of having to run payroll every payday or pay week for an individual, that smart contract is triggered by the conditions that are embedded into that smart contract.
We have emerging payroll organizations that are promoting that they use blockchain today. So one of those leaders in our industry who are providing services using blockchain. So this is not, no longer a concept. This is reality.
Hi, Demetrius. Hi, Linda. Welcome to the show. Would you mind introducing yourselves to our audience?
Thank you, David. This is Dimitri Papageorgiou, Global Payroll Advisory Leader for Accenture's Talent and Organization Practice.
I'm Linda Obertin, Director of Shared Services at DXC Technology, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and part of the Payday podcast.
Awesome. From the very first conversation with both of you, it was really clear that this topic has intense interest and rapid evolution. And in fact, I know you guys just came off a similar presentation at the APA event, really great organization that I think does wonders for the payroll profession. Now, there are fundamental changes coming to the employee data, payroll, HR, and some new technologies like blockchain that are enabling the role of payroll and HR to change. So I was really thinking of how we'd start this conversation. And the simplest way I was able to understand the change when I was talking to both of you is by focusing on the concept of data custodianship. So let's start there with the shift in data custody. In the relationship between employers, vendors, and employees, who are the data custodians today, and how is that changing? And I'll open that up to both of you to jump in and kind of give your perspective.
Data custody, as it stands today, is a task that it's the responsibility of a person, whether it's an employee or an individual. It is a task that it's part of an employer, and then it's a task for all the vendors that are servicing that employer. So if you think of how data propagates today across systems and vendors, there is multiple versions of the same data being hosted and safeguarded in multiple locations. The concept that we are introducing as part of the evolution in technology is that data custody will move to the employee exclusively, and that employee will then authorize companies or vendors to have access to said data whenever they need access to that data for processing something on their behalf.
Thanks, Dimitri, and totally agree. I think there may be a little bit of a false sense of security that the employer is the key and primary source for the data, because we know when you have a new addition to your family and you have a birth of a child, really the first place that you're sharing that news is on Facebook, it's with your family, and many times the employer is lagging. And so I completely agree with Demetrius that, again, data custodians are the employer, and then it's distributed to all of the partners that require the information, and then it's governed by many country and global privacy regulations. But really, the data does belong to the individual, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about that today. But we, as employers, spend millions of dollars on ensuring that data is current, it's accurate, But really, it truly does belong to the employee.
What's the role that some of the other organizations play in this, right? The financial institutions like the banks that hold employee and the information for my accounts or your accounts. What is the role of benefits providers in today's model of data custodianship?
Well, I think to some degree they are expected to be consumers of the data because they need it in order for them to be able to service
Hmm.
organizations, in addition to being safeguards of said data. They are expected to maintain proper procedures, firewalls, governance of said data in order to protect your safe your well-being. Although we have heard in numerous times that that data has been exposed to people that have meant to do inappropriate things with it.
Yeah, and you're seeing the just the sheer number of cyber crimes happening in the world today. And so I think, Linda, you sort of alluded to some of the problems that exist within this custodianship model. So what are some of these concrete problems that exist in today's model of data custodianship?
I think first is the source and ensuring the source is timely, it's accurate, again, that we have the most current information. And then it is how we distribute it through our infrastructure, how we protect it, how we mask it, how we ensure that, again, there is privacy and it's not being mishandled, misused, but also that commitment to our employees is ensuring that our third parties, whether that is a benefit provider, a travel partner for business travel, and even for survey information, that we're protecting it, especially with global organizations. It's very important to understand GDPR and how the information is being utilized. In our large mega systems, data is flowing each and every day. And it's a tremendous obligation and commitment, to manage the data with the highest level of integrity and security.
Linda, if I could just summarize some of the problems you're talking about, this idea is that there's actually a false sense of who the data custodian is. We've sort of bestowed this responsibility on the employer, but they are not usually the best source for new information or updates to that information. And then maybe the second component to it is that even as today's data custodian for employee information, organizations are extremely vulnerable to cybersecurity threats, to data breaches, where the ultimate victim of that crime is the employee who has trusted the employer with that data. Is that fair?
I think that's, David, a very fair statement. Employers are spending millions of dollars, as I mentioned, on cybersecurity, and perhaps we're even a little bit late to the game. We see headlines each and every day around data being stolen, and of course, the recent pipeline example impacting so many individuals around the globe, and especially on the East Coast. It truly impacted the stock market. It impacted our ability to travel. And data hackers are more than just stealing data. They're actually stealing our livelihoods and our ability to really pursue all the daily interests that we have. But what I wanted to add as well, from a data security perspective, as employers do spend millions on data, we're only as good as the hackers, that have access to similar tools and actually even have more advanced tools. And I think that's really the challenge for so many employers, especially perhaps smaller employers that are dependent on third parties.
Yeah, and Demetrius, we were just talking about this idea of the challenges in today's model. What is the model that you are envisioning for the future of data custodianship?
To explain the model, we first have to understand how data propagates today across vendors and systems. Every time that there is an integration and importation of data of any kind, there is a new version of that data. That means in a server somewhere, we are saving what we consider to be accurate and timely data. And then it becomes the responsibility of the parties involved in that exchange of data to ensure that that data is always accurate. That, of course, creates the present state of data, which means that we will have our social security, for example, it probably exists right now in over 1,000 systems. Because it's not just a payroll company, it is the company that employs you, it's the companies that used to employ you, it's anybody that you have applied for credit for, and many other ways where somebody has had access to your social security. The shift that we are recommending to take place is to utilize emerging technologies such as blockchain to create a single source of truth for that data that is being visited by individuals that need to have access to it, but it is not being downloaded, it is not being owned by them, and it is owned by the individual or the employee in this case.
Well, within our systems as well, I think there's a high level of integrity, at least intended within all of our systems, but there are still too many manual touch points. I think within all of our ecosystems, we want to have data flow automatically, seamlessly from the entry point of the source all the way through the infrastructure and disseminated to our third parties. But we have many manual touch points, and that iteration of touching data, we're losing quality and integrity each and every day, and that continues to impact all of our deliverables, impacts the employee experience, and also impacts the services that they receive. So there, again, we still have too many manual touch points today in our environments.
You're absolutely right that manual touch points do introduce risk to the data custody process and data quality. But I will also add that even if we get to the utopic state that everything is integrated and everything is propagated timely and real-time data, we will still have concerns around data retention and who potentially could gain access to that data, even if it's flowing through systems and stored properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a really good analogy you guys used offline with me about the data on my phone and the permissions around it, whether it's geo data or even some of the health data. I thought that really crystallized the point for me. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's easy to understand.
From a geodata, I think one of the more recent examples that I have from an employment tax perspective is hearing about individuals who are working in California, but they may have indicated they work in Nevada, but California is actually using mobile phones to understand where the majority of the calls are actually being originated, and then sending individuals in California personal income tax bills. So I think that, again, as the employer, we assume we're the holder of that data. We assume we know where the employees are living and working, but really there are other sources that may have more accurate information. And using geo-tracking and other mechanisms, have a higher reliability.
Linda, I will add to that, and I think this is a phenomenal example that you shared, but I will add to that personal data in general, not just employee data, is the new oil, and payroll, I think, is the new oil field. So understanding that everybody wants access to that data, because if you will notice when you drive around on your phone and you have one of those driving apps like Waze, you will see things popping up that say, there's a store close by that, according to your interests, has things on sale. And that means that somebody is actively mining data with your preferences, with your previous browsing history, and real time providing feedback to you, potentially driving consumer behaviors. Same thing I think exists from a taxation and from an employment perspective, where we can start utilizing said data, not only for paying people appropriately, but also exercising performance and talent management.
Yes, we've always promoted that we have a gold mine of data within HR and payroll, and now we see how it can be utilized. And if we would channel that for our leaders to have predictive analytics, so turning the data, into information that can help drive the business, help drive our talent strategies, help drive results, is really the richness as Demetrius is describing.
And as this data starts to shift and the custodianship model changes where the employee owns all that data, we'll talk about keys and smart contracts when we get into blockchain discussions. But How is the relationship of vendors then changing as well, right? So up to now, we've just talked about the employer and the employee, but there are payroll organizations, benefits organizations, and many others that are currently involved in data movement, data management around that, employee-employer contract. So what role does the vendor play, or how does it change in this model? I thought that was a really interesting thing that you guys had illustrated in the past.
In essence, vendors become consumers of said data, a trusted party that has access to the data, and that access is conditional and provisioned by the owner of the data, which is in this case the employee. They always have access to the latest and greatest information. There is no question whether or not the data is correct, assuming that the person who enters the data knows what they're entering. But in essence, the ownership and thereby the responsibility of keeping the data accurate and timely is always with the source of the data, the origin of the data, which is the employee.
In that situation, Dimitri, a payroll vendor like CloudPay or any other would essentially source all the employee data from the employee themselves, right? Their bank details, all the information necessary to process their payroll. They get that information from the employee directly without needing to go through the employer. And then that information, I guess, in subsequent roles, if the employee moves to another organization where the payroll company is the same company, it actually eliminates the need to go get new data because you're kind of following this employee along.
You're absolutely correct. In essence, CloudPay would be sourcing data from two different sources. One would be the employee with all the relevant information that are needed from the employee, such as demographic information, dependents, and so forth. And they will also be sourcing from the employer as to what the employee needs to be paid. If it is a situation where the employee actually receives different pay on a weekly basis, if they are an hourly employee, or they potentially are receiving something in the form of a smart contract if they're a salaried employee.
Yes, and if we think of that example today, there are already models that are using this custodianship. When we think of all of our credit records and who's managing our credit records on behalf of all of the reporting agencies, there are 3 or 4 majority credit organizations who manage our credit scores. And if we want to not allow access for, another a loan or perhaps any other type of insight into that credit record, we lock it. So we as an employee lock that record and we say, no, unfortunately, we're not going to provide access to any of the other consumers. And so we're using that model to indicate that there is, again, some interaction, but the employee ends up as the data custodian, the owner, and they direct what information can be shared, when do I unlock it, when can that information be accessed? And as Demetrius mentioned previously, all that history is stored there as well. So they know exactly who's accessed it at one point in time and what they have, and then when they can turn that key to unlock it. Another example of being the data custodian, would be an example of how we use our apps on our phones. Many of them are employment related, and we actually provide the permissions. Would I like my benefit provider to have access to my health information? What about that HSA provider and wellness provider? Do I provide all of my personal statistics around my weight and my health and additional information, more so than I've even shared with my employer? So there are so many ancillary applications that we're using, and they're applicable right now, especially being employment driven. And we have the ability today to turn them on and turn them off. And to Demetrius' point, we'll have thousands of those in the future. We already have hundreds today. So you can think of how our data is being propagated among all of these applications. And the importance is the ability to understand who's using the data, how they're using it, and myself as a consumer to be able to have that on and off switch.
If we were to think in a futuristic manner how this permissioning would work and potentially using our mobile phones, Instead of CloudPay receiving the information from the employer or us once every time that there is a change, think of that provisioning happening dynamic every time all the data that CloudPay needs in order to calculate paycheck from us, um, with a prompt coming to our phone saying, do you authorize CloudPay access to your digital persona from an employee perspective to calculate your paycheck? And it could be something that it would be a simple prompt, or it would be just a simple notification with an understood kind of agreement that if within 15 minutes you don't object to that, CloudPay has access to do what it needs to do in order to process the paycheck. So I think it's just a shift in the way that data is exchanged and handled today. We are much more in a replication world today. And I think what we are recommending through the use of technology in the future is real-time data on demand, not stored, not saved, but owned and processed as needed.
And I think you've talked about the idea of global employee ID, right, as one of the things that will enable this, or one of the outputs of this, where the same way we each have a unique social security number here in the US and there are parallels in other parts of the world, you'd have this global employee ID that follows you around and essentially becomes one of the keys to gaining access to your data. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I'm currently working with clients that are exploring the concept of global employee ID because they realized that it's very difficult for them to propagate across their various countries the data for employees without having that underlying unifying common denominator from an ID perspective. And I would, often the argument is everybody has an employment ID, but that employment ID is not necessarily what the vendors are using to identify that employee. So in a perfect scenario, the vendors and the employers would all have the same ID, the same point of reference to the employee, thereby making it extremely easy to reconcile that they have accurate data, that they're talking about the right person, and regardless of the whereabouts of that person, they're processing things correctly.
And Linda, I know you've led a lot of organizations through change. And some of these changes that we're talking about may take decades. And, there'll be firms that lead the way, and there'll be others that maybe take small steps towards this future. How will this change take place in an organization? It seems like a major cultural change. What do you think?
Oh, most definitely. It will take decades. Again, as I mentioned, there will be early adopters, and we know there are adopters today using blockchain and using smart contracts, ensuring that the employee is the data custodian, but they're definitely on the leading edge. And the first is education. In doing a quick search on blockchain education, there are over 2 million returns, and every university around the world is now offering courses in executive leadership on blockchain. So it is entering our organizations through training, through education, but there is a significant amount of change to embrace, to adopt, and also it needs to flow into, of course, strategy, because without a strategic plan on how we're going to adopt the new concepts and how we're going to integrate them into our strategic plans, because it will change the way that we work. It'll change our views on how we provide services. It will change our infrastructure. It will change every aspect of our business and organization. Again, hopefully it'll be much better in the future and much less, I'll say, transaction-based data processing, but it will be a tremendous change. So education is key, and strategic planning, of course, to introduce the new plans.
What do you think is going to be driving the change? Do you think risk mitigation, especially as concerns around cybersecurity bubble up, or even pressures from employees, maybe new generations of workers that enter the workforce and have a different relationship to data privacy? Do you think some of those will be catalysts for this change?
Oh, most definitely. There will be some, again, conservative players in the markets. We know that GDPR and other regulatory aspects of managing data, will continue to be very strong. And, we need to continually be understanding, what are the risks and ensuring that we're mitigating the risk, but also that comes through the education of understanding this is actually a more secure method of working and managing individual information, transferring some of that ownership, which is going to be a huge education and cultural change. And as cybersecurity was an emerging trend and critical business need in the last 20 years, as we look to the future, blockchain is going to be taking that role. And blockchain is truly the new cybersecurity as we look to the future.
Linda, I will add that for those of us that watched parts of the hearings that were taking place in Congress on cybersecurity and Facebook and how data is being used, it became evident that in many ways the regulatory bodies don't necessarily understand enough to be able to properly litigate and legislate on how data custody needs to take place on a go forward basis.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is as we have digital natives becoming mainstream in the workforce, and baby boomers are exiting, and individuals that are of generations that were not necessarily brought up as digital natives. I think the demand for ownership of data by those individuals is going to increase, but the regulatory body has to very, very quickly catch up and be able to understand and legislate accordingly.
Dimitris, do you think there are certain regions of the world, countries that will embrace this change first?
I think that it is easier for countries that have homogeneous populations that are used to be much more governed and regulated. And I'll use the example of Switzerland or Finland, that are countries that have the relationship between the citizen and the country is very, very well defined, and there is a certain level of trust and understanding between the two. I think countries that actually have that ability and are more advanced in that space will probably lead the race in terms of creating that trusted relationship between regulatory bodies and consumers. I think countries that don't have the same uniformity in terms of beliefs or trust into the system will be laggards in getting there.
And it's interesting to think about that relationship and the trust that's required. Do you think in these less homogenous developed countries, unions will have a role to play in changing this relationship?
I think unions, in the context that we use unions in the US or works councils outside the US, will always have a vested interest in the safeguarding and appropriate usage of employee data. At the same time, I would also highlight the fact that I don't think that most individuals that are staffing those unions or thinking and protecting employees and their well-being necessarily comprehend everything that they will need to comprehend in order to appropriately advocate for the best interest of the employee.
And it's just interesting for me to think about this entire change almost as a way to sidestep the arm race in cybersecurity that we're now starting to see, right? It's just interesting to see some organizations really make significant changes and start investing and prioritizing their infrastructure around cyber crimes and protecting themselves against this. This seems like a way to get around it in some ways, right? By moving towards blockchain and some of the new technology and changing the model around data ownership. Is that the right way to think about it, or am I oversimplifying it?
I think you're spot on. It is a way to mitigate and avoid, in some cases, the spend that it's now being expected to take place from organizations as well as employees, because in every organization that there is an allocation of budget towards cybersecurity and prevention of any malicious attempts to gain access to systems or data. And that same movement is also happening at the individual level, where consumers like you and I are subscribing to services, whether it's a credit bureau or an agency that monitors the dark web and other areas where potentially there could be risk for your individual data. And we subscribe and spend along those lines money to prevent harm from coming our way through data. I think the shift that we are recommending around using a much more secure way of data propagation via blockchain will in many ways prevent that spend from taking place, alleviate that burden from both individuals as well as organizations, while introducing a much more accurate, much more timely data exchange.
We'll be right back to our conversation, but I want to tell you about a new service from CloudPay called CloudPay Now. It's the only global solution to earned wage access, or on-demand pay as it's known in the US, and we've seen remarkable interest in this product from HR professionals, benefits and total rewards managers, and global payroll practitioners. We think it's really going to revolutionize how and when employees get paid. You can learn more about this new service and request a free demo for your company by visiting cloudpay.com/now. And with that little break, let's get back to our conversation with Linda and Dimitri. We opened by alluding to some of the new technologies that are going to enable these, right? So let's stay on blockchain specifically. Can you explain its potential impact on the employee-employer relationship as it relates to data ownership? Contextualize this technology a little bit, especially in its relationship to payroll and HR.
Absolutely. So, I'd like to use something that we're all familiar with, which is the WWW, the World Wide Web. Right now, the World Wide Web works with the propagation of data across multiple sites that is stored in multiple servers. And every time that we actually view said data, it's either temporary data or permanent data if we decide to download it. Temporary data actually gets purged after we use the data. In that present world, data is actually propagated through replication. With blockchain being a new protocol that is actually going to change that data propagation, it's the expectation is that we have something that can take data and create an immutable record, meaning that record cannot be changed by anybody other than the person who desires and has access to do so, and only for building upon said data. So you can actually change your address, but your old address will never go away. Your social security cannot be changed because it's an immutable record, unless there is extended circumstances. But the concept is that you're creating versions of data that are being secured in what is the blockchain. So every block of data becomes a container that stores information for you or others, and then becomes part of the chain. And you cannot go back and edit said data. So blockchain is a protocol of data that creates the certainty that needs to be in place, that once you commit the data, it cannot be accessed by anybody that doesn't have authorization to do so. It creates an immutable record. So unlike systems of today where I can go and edit, if I have the right access, I can go and change the hire date of somebody, even though that person was hired 7 years ago. I can go and do whatever I need to do if I am an authorized user. In the case of blockchain, that hire date would never go away. You can amend the hire date if there is a reason for it, and then reference that new hire date, but that old hire date would never disappear.
So keys essentially allow you to determine which other entities or which other organizations have access to that block of data. And then what role do smart contracts play in this?
So, in the key, you're absolutely right, is the authorization of entities or parties to the data that you are willing to share or commit to a process. And the smart contract in the context of payroll can actually be used to take the employment contract that one has and convert it into a predictable, repeatable transaction. In essence, instead of having to run payroll every payday or pay week for an individual, that smart contract is triggered by the conditions that are embedded into that smart contract, saying that David has to get paid every Friday $1,500. And that $1,500 is executed without anybody having to prompt anything. And there is no reason for anybody to prompt anything unless there is a change.
Demetrius, I think this technology also will fundamentally change the skill set required of employees in an organization, right? So, how is this going to drive the need to reskill talent? And what are going to become the critical skills necessary in the workforce to work with this kind of environment?
I think this aligns very well with the concept of data not necessarily being entered by people. And in addition to that, by having individuals in HR and other functions of an organization focusing on value add activities versus transactional. What do I mean by that? If you look at how transactional work has evolved, we went from having individuals that were doing end to end of processes to segmentation of processes, creation of shared services, committing all commoditized type of services into those shared services, and then having people that are actually catering to those transactional activities. Mm-hmm. The evolution of this is if we remove the need for that administration, for that transaction, is that employees will now be focusing much more on the value add activities as well as the empathy, a human interaction that has gone missing in our effort to find efficiency in operations.
Talent and skills are very critical for our organizations, especially in human resources and payroll. And we've always had this gold mine of data, as we've mentioned earlier, but analytics is still key. So, how we use that data, how we leverage it to be proactive, to be predictive, to be more agile with the services that we're delivering will be key, because as we move up the value chain of utilization of blockchain, our customers are going to be looking for the benefits. And the benefits are faster service delivery, more integrity in our data. The value proposition is all about continued protection, privacy, speed to market, speed to consumer. And our consumers and our employees are going to be asking even more of us. So as we prepare and look out to the future, we already have very high demands, and need to align empathy and personalization in our services within HR and payroll. And again, this evolution will actually continue to demand more of HR and payroll organizations. And I think that's an important aspect that we haven't really focused on, the servicing. So servicing should be more immediate. Our customer service SLAs will need to be even shorter in the future. I know today, as I work with organizations, I hear about a 4-hour SLA for consumers. Of course, there's a real-time acknowledgement that query was requested, and perhaps a 4-hour SLA, but that will need to become even more real-time in the future. As Demetrius mentioned, with the evolution of the technology, there may only be a short window to acknowledge an event and activity. And if there's any type of question, because there will be questions, yet there will be, further understanding of how this will be utilized, how it'll impact other, perhaps benefits, other programs. And it continues to, I'll say, evolve the customer service aspect of payroll and human resources.
And Linda, I will add that we do respond to credit alerts or consumer alerts that we receive from our banks or credit cards about potentially suspicious charges or something that may require our attention. So this is happening today to some degree, and I think we just need to get more accustomed to having this type of prompts on a daily basis.
I think that's a great example as we were talking about real-time examples for blockchain and the ability to turn on, turn off your bank card real time because there may be some fraud or at least pause it from any future charges is a great example of how this is being used today with consumers, but they may not understand some of the technology that's making this possible. And so we'll continue to need to enhance our services, our customers' expectations, will continue to drive competitive advantage for many employers.
And there's a really prominent case here of shared services and what role they play in the future, right? It's kind of interesting to see what is going to be the skill set and the role of shared services in the future. What do you see, and how do you see that developing?
I think shared services will always have a role because there will still be a need for insights to be derived
Mhm.
from an organization and its employees. So, but much more of a strategic role versus the present tactical transactional type of role. So it's more of an evolution of services that will focus on presenting the business that shared services is meant to provide value to, predictive and prescriptive insights versus today's environment where most shared services departments are focusing on the descriptive and diagnostic type of activities.
And Demetrius, let's put you in the shoes of a global HR or global payroll practitioner today. What are you going to be doing today to prepare for this future?
For anybody that wants to be part of the future, the first step would be make yourself aware of what these technologies are able to do, how they may impact what we do today, and then start thinking through your pain points of everyday work and how potentially the change in thinking or processing could alleviate those pain points. There's no better person to provide solutions to one's problem than the person themselves if they're allowing themselves to think beyond their day-to-day behavioral activities.
The idea that blockchain is already finding use cases within the HR and payroll space was really interesting to me. There were about 4 or 5 use cases that already exist. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Oh, yes, we have emerging payroll organizations that are promoting that they use blockchain today. So, one of those leaders in our industry who are providing services using blockchain. So, this is not, no longer a concept. This is reality. And if we even, search on all of our large ERP providers, they all have a blockchain consulting practice. And so, this is reality. And in order to get to that level of consultancy, there's been years in the making of understanding it internally. I know internal infrastructures are already leveraging blockchain, and it's really available. We just as consumers have not had direct access to the inner workings of what's behind some of our large infrastructure ERPs, behind the scenes of our large corporate organizations. It's already been in play. We're just not quite aware from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, and it's I read up on the idea that we're using this already in employee background checks, right?
Mhm.
In data security access, payment and benefits already are using some elements of blockchain technology.
Yes, it definitely, again, adds efficiency for organizations. And so internally, they're leveraging it to move data, to secure data, to, again, not be touching data. And it's really now that emergence of engaging the actual consumer and the owner of the data. So changing that ownership. So the first steps already are in motion.
That's very true. And I think the fact that this future is, maybe a few decades away does allow you to create a roadmap for upskilling and, maneuvering within an organization to set yourself up for that future. I heard you mention, and I am definitely behind this skill set, that the average skill will be, I think it was Python knowledge you've said to me, right? And that's really more around becoming that data analyst and a person that could provide a business with that predictive insight. Is that right?
Python was used as an example for an easy transitional step into something that it's emerging and definitely beneficial to many. And it's a transitional step from Excel. So if you have individuals that are able to do, I would say, whether it's macros or advanced Excel skills, their ability to migrate to Python is much higher than having to pick up a completely new skill. But once you understand Python, then you can start expanding beyond Python to all other emerging, I would say, either application languages or concepts that exist in infancy today, but in a very, very accelerated path to coming to operation.
I'd love to bring this all together and specifically into the payroll function now. Can you describe the process redesign that payroll organizations will have to go through in preparation and once these changes take place, right? Can you kind of, it's the change in data custodianship, it's the change in the vendor relationship, the ability to use blockchain and smart contracts. What does this do for payments? And let's please not talk about cryptocurrency. What does it do around data mobility, onboarding processes, and even looking for a new job? What does this look like for an organization?
From a payroll perspective, I think it alleviates the burden that most payroll organizations have, whether it's in an in-house captive situation or an outsourced situation, to ensure that they have timely data to maintain and present an employee with part of their employee value proposition, which is being paid on time and accurately. So there is no need for the payroll company to be concerned whether or not they're going to receive the information timely. There is no need for validation of said data. There is no need for anything that pertains to the employee again. And assuming that the organization has embraced the same concept, the employer, the same need for comfort or the same comfort feeling in terms of the quality of data should exist on the employer and employee side. Now, the payroll company evolves to much more of a service provider to the employee and to the company than simply a transactional partner. What do I mean by that? That's where the payroll company can start aggregating data on multiple employees and start presenting value add activities back to the employer, where they can say, here's what we're actually able to derive by processing payroll on your behalf in terms of retention strategies. And by analyzing payroll data, they can now add value to the employer with insights that the employer may not have had the ability to do so, especially when it's contextualized to an industry or to a geography.
So as we look to the future in utilizing blockchain, the individual has the ownership to turn on the key. If they're looking for a new role and they apply for new roles, they truly need to turn on the key, and the employer has the data at their fingertips to process the application, manage the recruiting process, and take it all the way into the full life cycle of the employee. The mobility becomes very fluid. The employee experience becomes very expedient and real time. So talent management becomes easier for organizations, but the individual has the highest experience, much more so than today. It creates that competitive advantage for organizations to expedite their recruiting, their onboarding, and then engage the individual into their new role very quickly. And so the benefits of having the mobility around the data movements, are really key for organizations to meet business demands.
I think there's some very practical things that this is going to shift and change, and then those are really good examples of the kind of things that it'll enable. We've had conversations already with with organizations about how long it takes for somebody who starts at their job to actually receive their first paycheck, right? Because if you didn't hit the payroll cycle at the right time, if you didn't get the data into all the critical systems and have it propagated, as Dimitri has mentioned, across all of the relevant vendors to process their paycheck or make sure that their insurance is properly set up, this shift allows that immediacy where maybe you'll have access to your insurance provider right away and you don't need to plan your doctor's visit for a month from your start date, and you might have access to your money immediately instead of waiting for an extra pay cycle. So there's some really tangible benefits that the employee is going to get, and I think ultimately improve the relationship between employee and employer overall.
And one question I have for actually Demetrius, because he is out enabling organizations, and so this is real life examples for the work that he's leading. I'm just curious if there are different, I'll say, marketing when we talk about education and really embracing the concepts. Are there different brand and marketing aspects that we need to consider as an organization as we continue to evolve to this future model?
I think brand and marketing is evolving in many ways, and we're seeing it. Most organizations are declaring themselves to be either in a transitional stage or have already made that transition. And I'll give you the example of Ford, which no longer brands itself as a automaker but as a technology company. So I think as that evolution is happening, not only do we need to be rethinking our brand and our mission, kind of revisiting the reason why we're in existence in business, but also how do we market our services to others? Because the traditional means of marketing are quickly fading away with the emergence of digital natives being our main consumers.
So this is an opportunity for organizations to reinvent themselves as they're embracing the new technology and the evolution. And I think that's an important part of the change management,
Mhm.
not only for an HR organization or payroll organization, but also for the entire enterprise to understand the importance of rebranding to attract the right talent and really level set the expectation, that we are leveraging technology and optimizing, the future trends. So very important for organizations to be aware.
Absolutely, especially as they compete for workforces, right? I think who's going to be
Mhm.
first in enabling these kind of changes and benefits? Who's going to then articulate that and rebrand themselves to get employees to join to win over talent, especially as that competition starts to become more global. And Demetrius, you had mentioned that education is a critical enabler, an important step in preparedness for this change. So, besides this episode, what other resources, books, videos, podcasts, white papers, whatever, do you suggest our listeners check out to learn more about blockchain, to learn more about the change in data ownership and custodianship? What are some resources you would encourage people go check out?
I would definitely encourage people to listen to TEDx presentations around the future of technology, because everything starts, being contextualized better once you start understanding how we're going towards quantum computing and thereby a change in the paradigm of how data, the analog and digital system, will change forever. The second thing that I would also recommend is familiarizing oneself with blockchain and what that blockchain protocol does. And I think we've all been exposed, as you mentioned, to the cryptocurrency side of blockchain, but there is much more to it, intended or unintended, because I actually think it was unintentional that somebody created blockchain and had the potential that it has to change the world that we perceive today forever. Because it was meant for cryptocurrency, but I think cryptocurrency is just an outcome or a byproduct of blockchain. And the third thing is, I would say, upskill and reskill oneself in terms of what they do today in the context of a world where data becomes paramount and central to being safeguarded. Because we've had way too many instances in today's world where data has been stolen, data has been hacked, and data has actually been locked. Yeah, as in the case of the pipeline, the recent pipeline incident, where you're actually prevented from even accessing the data. That's what actually happened there. The ransomware situation there was that the hackers were not allowing the company access to their own systems.
Yeah, and I think this idea of the decentralization of data has the the consequence of making it more challenging to hack, to make a significant impact on and disruption in the economy as well, right? The fact that it's individuals that will have their data and will have the key and the ability to issue access, and not a single organization that may be holding on to millions of records.
Absolutely. I would also say that if it's created by a human, that means it can actually be hacked. So blockchain has been created by humans, and that means somebody who understands how blockchain works potentially could really find ways to jeopardize the data integrity there. Right now, what prevents that from happening is the computing power that exists in commercial use today doesn't have the ability to do so. But I think once we get into quantum computing, then some of the thinking that exists today about the security and safety of blockchain would have to be revisited and refreshed as well.
But you don't see these as troubling enough to prevent us from marching towards that future, because you still see that as a more secure way of maintaining data, and a more, and a better way to enable practitioners to have kind of more strategic roles in a company than anything else that's in existence today. Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think the space in terms of people that understand both quantum computing and blockchain is extremely limited, and it will never present enough of an issue, at least for the foreseeable future, to prevent anybody from moving into what is now a very, very secure means of data storage and data propagation under the blockchain protocol. In addition to that, I would say there is investment being made and thinking already around the blockchain 2.0 and the iterations that will, ensue post, I would say, general adoption of those concepts in order to continue evolving the model. The assumption is that anything that we create eventually will become obsolete, but we as species have the ability to continue evolving the thinking.
And David, I just wanted to add as well, back with this false sense of security. Over the holidays, I had the ability to send some friends a few gift cards, and many of them did not arrive in their mailbox, or even through express delivery. So what we consider today some of our secure methods of delivery, whether that is checks going through the U.S. mail, which there are still many paychecks and many personal checks, being sent through the U.S. mail. Many of them do not arrive at their intended designation. And so this is the paradigm change as well. To move to blockchain, we have to understand the methods that we're using today. While we may believe they're secure, they're not really secure. Our data is not secure. If we're putting something in a mailbox, we have no idea who's touching it on the other end, where it's actually being delivered to, and that may have personal information, especially if it contains a personal check. And then you move to our applications, as we discussed. We really have limited availability to understand when it's hacked, who's using it. Many times I log on to my iPhone, it will tell me my passwords have been compromised and I should go in and change those passwords. So this is all a journey of understanding, how do we best prepare and how do we ensure we have that security in the future, because it really does not exist today, as much as we really spend millions on personal security and also on employee data security.
That's a great point, right? We are not trying to march towards perfect here. We're moving to better. This was a really fun conversation. Thank you so much, Linda and Demetrius. I hope you come back to talk to us about these changes as they start to make their inroads into organizations. But at this point, thanks so much for appearing on the Payday podcast.
David, thank you for the opportunity. This is such an important topic, and we need to understand the trends in the marketplace. And this is a trend that there really is not a lot of information for organizational leaders to understand, to plan in their strategies. And so thank you for taking the time to host such an important topic. It was a pleasure to be here with both yourself and Demetrius.
Linda and I consider ourselves evangelists because we truly believe that this is good news. We truly believe that this is a movement towards betterment of not only the payroll industry, but in general, consumer and employer data. And appreciate that Cloudbase is giving us this platform and podcast opportunity.
Great. Well, we hope you come back. Thank you so much. This was fun. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode of the Payday Podcast. I'm your host, David Barak, and this show is a product of CloudPay and its incredible teams. To listen to more episodes, look for us wherever you get your podcasts or visit us at cloudpay.com.